recognizes St. Mark's founder, Father Henry Carr. In a remarkable life and career in Canadian Catholic post-secondary education during the first half of the 20th century, Father Carr carried on negotiations leading to the original Federation Agreement between St. Michael's College and the University of Toronto in 1910, was the founder of the Pontifical Institute of Medieval Studies, principal of St. Thomas More College at the University of Saskatchewan, as well as serving as Superior General for his religious community, Archduke, 5 years later in 1956. Father Carr guided St. Mark's through its early years, including the construction of our original campus, and as we now enter our 60th anniversary, we remember him as our founder and our visionary. Some housekeeping items. First of all, washroom access is via the elevator or stairs to my left. Photography, we have official photographers here for the program. You're welcome to take photos from your phone, but please turn off the ringer and the flash. Please feel free to send tweets throughout the evening. I can't say that without laughing because I'm just new to this, as some of my colleagues here know. But you can use the hashtag Carr Lecture 2016. The hashtag is also found on the back of the response cards on each seat. The format for this evening's presentation will be as follows. I will introduce our speaker, who will be followed by a question period that I will moderate, during which we will be invited to direct questions to our speaker from the microphones that have been placed on both sides of the chapel. In the interest of time and in order to accommodate other questions, please be sure to have a clear and concise question for our speaker. I knew that would also get a laugh. Now for this evening's talk. Tonight, our featured speaker will address the future of the Church under the guidance of Pope Francis. 50 years after the end of the Second Vatican Council, we are seeing in this Holy Father the first Pope, also a member of the Congregation of St. Basil, and has been chief shepherd of Vancouver's 450,000 Catholics since 2009. Prior to this appointment, he served in the Vatican's Secretariat of State, as president of the University of St. Thomas in Houston, and as Archbishop Secretary of the Congregation of Catholic Education in Rome. Archbishop Miller currently serves on the Commission for Christian Unity of the Canadian Conference of Catholic Bishops and represents the conference at the Pontifical Committee for the International Eucharistic Congresses. Since his arrival in Vancouver, the Archbishop has implemented numerous new initiatives, including the Apostolate of Catholic Education for Teachers, a First Nations ministry, a Theology of the Body office, and the first permanent diaconate program in the Archdiocese. Archbishop Miller taught theology for many years in Houston, Mexico, and Rome, and is a prolific author, and of particular relevance to us this evening, is a specialist on the papacy and modern papal teaching, as well as a popular speaker at conferences around the world. His Grace, Archbishop Miller.
Thank you very much, Dr. Meehan. A special thank you for this invitation to give the Carr Lecture here at the colleges founded by my confreres, the Basilian Fathers. And behind the bold vision to establish St. Mark's College was, of course, Father Carr, together with a group of very engaged lay Catholics here in the Archdiocese. I never met Father Carr. He died 2 years before I entered the congregation, but I had heard of him, having received the Henry Carr Scholarship as a young student to attend the University of Toronto. And when I was a seminarian, Father Carr was held up as a giant, an inspiring figure. He was an ecumenist before Vatican II. He was a great sports enthusiast, and as Dr. Meehan mentioned, he was a man with a mission to establish Catholic higher education on secular campuses, especially in Ontario and Western Canada. He was a true pioneer, and 50 years after first hearing about Father Carr, I really am delighted to be able to give this Carr Lecture this evening. But tonight I want to talk about another pioneer, another prophet, known simply by the two-syllable word Francis. I want to talk about the current successor of the Apostle Peter and the future of the Catholic Church under his leadership. What we can glean about the direction in which he is guiding the worldwide church, and also our own local church here in the Archdiocese of Vancouver. What difference does he make? In fact, given today's extensive media coverage of the Pope, the ministry of Peter has assumed such overwhelming influence that it's no exaggeration to say that the future of every local church is inextricably bound up with the leadership of the Pope. And now at the outset, I want to affirm something that I believe many in the popular media miss, and it's just this. Pope Francis puts Jesus Christ and the gospel before anything else in his life and in his teaching. For him, to live the gospel simply and radically is central to any reform in the church. Spiritual renewal must precede any institutional reform. And so I will deal with both his convictions about this spiritual renewal, and then with a few of his ideas, depending on the time, for the institutional updating or aggiornamento that he has been developing in the last 3 years. When the Cardinal Archbishop of Buenos Aires, Jorge Mario Bergoglio, chose the name Francis upon becoming Pope, he set himself squarely in the footsteps of the Poverello of Assisi, whose overriding call and mission was to renew the church. While St. Francis first understood very literally the Lord's call to him at San Damiano, when the Lord from the crucifix said to him, "Francis, go and repair my church, which, as you see, is in ruins." Hearing that, he went about repairing that little chapel. But gradually he came to understand that what his master was really after was an interior renewal of the church, a renewal founded in a recommitment to the gospel. His mission was clear: a simple, radical return to the real gospel lived and preached by Jesus, to restore in the world, as was written, the way and the style of life of Jesus and the apostles as described in the Gospels. And like his namesake, Pope Francis is more, we can say, a poet of the faith rather than a synthetic or systematic thinker. And so the Pope doesn't give us any 10-point pastoral plan of what he intends or wants to do. He doesn't even speak directly of an agenda for renewal. And so it's up to us to extrapolate from the things that he says and the way he acts the direction he believes the church should be taking in our day. And it seems to me that the Pope's lack of a pastoral action plan, who, when, how long, etc., is based on his understanding of what he calls and refers to often as God's newness. That God is continually surprising us, opening our hearts, and guiding us in very unexpected ways. And so rather than any reliance on detailed planning, we are always to be ready to respond courageously to whatever challenges come our way. Listen to how he put it in an address to his collaborators in the Roman Curia. When the apostle, could be us, he was speaking to clerics, but when the apostle plans everything down to the last detail and believes that with perfect planning things will fall into place, he becomes an accountant or an office manager. Things need to be prepared well, but without ever falling into the temptation of trying to contain and direct the freedom of the Holy Spirit, which is always greater and more flexible than any human planning. In truth, he concluded, the Church shows her fidelity to the Holy Spirit to the extent that she does not try to control him. Walter Meyer, a correspondent in the German magazine Der Spiegel, made this same point a little more colorfully. This is what he wrote. If you ask cardinals and bishops, or the Pope's advisors and colleagues, or veteran Vatican observers about his possible strategy, the Pope's overwhelming plan, they only seem to agree on one point. The man who sits in the chair of Peter is a notorious troublemaker. While the Church should never remain closed in on herself and in the past, Francis is also, and people forget this, keenly aware that in order to progress towards the future, he wrote, we need the past. We need profound roots. The Pope is no iconoclast, despite the take of some pundits. Rather, he understands, as he wrote, God manifests himself in time and is present in the processes of history. And so we must be both alert and prudent in reading those signs that are tilted towards the future. Indeed, he counsels patience regarding change, recalling the patience of God, who did not hurry his history of salvation, but who preferred a long history for us of many years walking with us. In his very celebrated interview with Father Antonio Spadaro, the Jesuit editor of the Holy See's most authoritative journal, La Civiltà Cattolica, Francis observed, and I quote, "Many think that changes and reforms can take place in a short time. I believe that we always need time to lay the foundations for real, effective change." He believes that structural and organizational reforms are indeed necessary, but they come afterwards, in second place. The first reform must be, as he wrote, a reform in attitude. And so now I want to describe what I believe to be the principal spiritual reforms which the Pope points to as essential preconditions for ecclesial renewal. And then I'll direct my attention to a few of the institutional changes that he is gradually bringing about. In the lives, the Pope is showing us that the way of the Church today and in the future is the path of gospel radicalism and simplicity. And he emphasizes, and he's concerned that we have often lost in sort of a tangle of things, the essential core of the message, and that we have forgotten the language of simplicity. In fact, he said, at times we lose people because they don't understand what we are saying, because we have forgotten the language of simplicity and import an intellectualism foreign to our people. The Church's essential message must always, that's what we must concentrate on. We can't squander precious time on or effort in fostering what he says could be a disjointed transmission of a multitude of doctrines to be insistently imposed upon. It's not that the fullness of the gospel is not for us. We can't just pick and choose. His language is never like that. But he wants to tell us, what is the core? What do you start with? What do you hit off with in evangelization? He says, its charismatic core is the beauty and the saving love of God made manifest in Christ. This isn't a revolutionary idea, but the intensity with which he proclaims it is something, I think, new. It's in his homilies, it's in his catechetics. It's not usually in the headlines, but it's what he talks about more than anything else. He doesn't want the church to be locked up in what he calls the small things. The most important thing is always the first proclamation about being saved in Christ, which has, you have to unpack that. It means that we need salvation, we have to recognize, and so on. And he laments the fact that the media pays so much attention to certain moral issues that this obscures the primacy of the essential message. He wrote, for example, he says, certain issues which are part, he doesn't say they're not part, which are part of the church's moral teaching are taken out of the context which gives them their meaning. Rather, the message has to concentrate on the essentials, on what is most beautiful, most grand, and he says most appealing, and at the same time, the most necessary. In other words, before a person can understand and live the church's moral teaching, that person must first, as he says, grasp that he or she has been gazed upon and loved by a merciful God. That you have to get that. If you don't get that, there's not a rest. The church needs to use more understandable language. But he also adds, but in the process, the integrity of the gospel message must not be deformed. Not only does Pope Francis envision a more, I think we could call it evangelical Catholicism, with its emphasis on personal encounter and charisma, he also sees that ecclesial renewal is based on what he calls his dream of a church that is a mother and a shepherdess, and not, he says, a perfectly organized nonprofit with so many pastoral plans. Like St. Francis, he believes that people are looking for a church free from an officious attitude. They're looking for a church that loves in practical ways. And he wants the world to know that the church isn't here to condemn them. He wants them to see that a church is never hesitant to offer mercy. Francis, as you know, has declared this year, and this is so in keeping with his vision, this year to be an extraordinary jubilee of mercy, in which he is inviting everyone to live in the light of that word of God, be merciful as your Father is merciful. It's the occasion, he says, for all of us to rediscover the infinite mercy of the Father who welcomes everyone and goes out personally to encounter each of them. It is he who seeks us. It is he who comes to encounter us. And then he added, how much wrong we do to God and his grace when we speak of sins being punished by his judgment before we speak of their being forgiven by his mercy. And he adds, it's a paraphrase of St. Augustine. To convey this primacy of mercy, Francis uses many striking images. One is he refers to the church as the maternal womb of mercy. That the church is like a mother, never gives up on her children, even when they go astray. He said in an interview on one of his famous flights, returning from a visit to another country. This was coming back from Brazil. He said, "She, the church, is a merciful mother who understands, who has always sought to help and encourage even those of her children who have erred or are erring. She never closes the door to home. She does not judge, but offers God's forgiveness. She offers his love, which invites even those of her children who have fallen into a deep abyss to continue on their way. Like a mother, she must find a form of mercy for all." The maternal womb of mercy. But another great image is that, and you probably know this one, the church is like a field hospital. He says, "I see clearly that the thing the church needs most today is her ability to heal wounds and warm the hearts of the faithful." Notice the beautiful Caravaggio on the wall with, I think it must be Thomas with his hand in our Lord's hand. The church, what the church needs most today is this ability to heal wounds and warm the hearts of the faithful. It needs nearness, proximity. I see the church as a field hospital after battle. It is useless to ask a seriously injured person if he has high cholesterol and about the level of his blood sugars. You have to heal the wounds. Then we can talk about everything else. Heal the wounds, and you have to start from the ground up. The field hospital staff, that's us, clergy, lay faithful, on the field of battle, are first called then to treat major wounds, working desperately to stop the bleeding. Because people are spiritually gravely wounded. They are alienated from God. They are stuck in spiritual worldliness. They are adrift in an abyss with no sense of direction or purpose. They do need healing, and they need that healing fast. There's urgency. Field hospitals are usually tents set up, near the battlefield. Many risks, few resources, little equipment. Hours are long. A sense of cooperation is essential. Staff must rely on one another. Creative solutions and flexibility are the order of the day. All of these indications are just suggestions about what does this really mean? What does this mean for our parish life? What does this mean for our diocesan life? Much of that he leaves to us to think about and to act upon. The Pope has yet another dream. He's full of dreams. He has a dream about a poor church, which for him is the apostolic ideal, the vision of Francis. Just after his election, he was talking to the media, and he said, "How I would like a church which is poor and for the poor." It's double-barreled. In taking this path, the Pope is, of course, imitating St. Francis, who longed for a poor church, a church that took care of others. 800 years have passed since Francis. Times have changed. But for Pope Francis, the ideal of a poor and missionary church still holds. As he said, this is, in any case, the church that Jesus and his disciples preached. What does he mean? Really quite simple. The church must be poor in imitation of her founder, by making himself poor, as we read in St. Paul. Jesus did not seek, of course, poverty for its own sake, but so that by his poverty we might become rich. This is the poverty, the emptying out of the incarnation. The wealth of God's grace does not pass through our human wealth, the Pope affirms, but invariably and exclusively through our personal and communal poverty, enlivened by the Spirit of Christ. A poor church, therefore, doesn't depend on worldly power or prestige, let alone material wealth, but it depends upon the utter gratuity of God. And for Francis, moreover, the church is not only to be poor herself, but also to be a church for the poor, to make an option for the poor of the world. Because, as he says so frequently, the poor have much to teach us, because they know in their flesh the suffering of Christ. They have a unique proximity to him. In The Joy of the Gospel, he wrote, "We are called to find Christ in them, to lend our voice to their causes, but also to be their friends, to listen to them, to speak for them, and to embrace the mysterious wisdom which God wishes to share with us through them." That with the poor, we are not just teachers or benefactors, we are learners and beneficiaries. The church is called to be an instrument of God, he wrote, for the liberation and promotion of the poor. Thus, she must work to eliminate the structural causes of poverty, to promote integral development, to meet immediate needs by acts of solidarity, to foster their spiritual development, to engage in evangelization. In his groundbreaking encyclical published last summer, Laudato Si, on the care of our common home, the Holy Father repeatedly emphasized how the degradation, the ecological degradation that is around us, pollutants, global warming, unsafe water, and so on, that these harm the poor more than anyone else. This is what he wrote. In fact, the deterioration of the environment and of society affects the most vulnerable people on the planet. Both everyday experience and scientific research show that the gravest effects of all attacks on the environment are suffered by the poorest. That's why he's able to link ecology to the church's preferential option for the poor. And closely associated with this vision of a poor church for the poor is that of a church which steps outside of herself to go, to use his phrase, to the peripheries, to the outskirts, to the margins of existence. He's concerned that the faithful, that's us, are too insular, that we have retreated from outreach into the sacristy, into the comfort of sort of the church and churchiness, with the risk of slipping into a tribal mentality. He wants to open the church's doors to the world outside. One of his most famous quips, he said, "A church closed in on herself is a sick church. A self-referential church keeps Jesus Christ within herself and does not let him out." And to drive the point home, he He's drawn, at least on one occasion, on an image from the book of Revelation that we all know. Jesus standing at the door and knocking. You might know the pre-Raphaelite picture, Jesus holding a lantern before an open door, and he's gently knocking, hoping that he will be received. But the Pope gives this traditional image a real twist. He says, "But ask yourselves this question: how often is Jesus inside and knocking at the door to be let out, to come out? And we do not let him out because of our own need for security, because so often we are locked into ephemeral structures that serve solely to make us slaves and not free children of God." But this fear of stepping outside our comfort zones for Francis will not do, because we are to be missionary disciples. The Catholic Church is not just for active and practicing Catholics. It is indeed for the whole world, and specifically the call to sinners. In the joy of the gospel, the Pope shares yet another dream, that of what he calls the missionary option. And he tells us that what he would like is a missionary impulse, capable, he says, of transforming everything, so that the church's, his words, customs, ways of doing things, times and schedules, language and structures can be suitably channeled for the evangelization of today's world, to bring Jesus Christ, rather than for her self-preservation. All structures in the church, he says, have to be mission-oriented, put into a missionary key. And this thrust outwards to the peripheries is mirrored even in the places the Pope plans and has visited. How he likes to go to places popes have never been before, to places like Bolivia or the Central African Republic. He's very aware that the shift in Christianity is moving from being sort of a Euro-North American reality to finding its strength in Latin America and in Africa. Indeed, he's very aware that by 2050, European and Euro-American Catholics will be but a small fraction of the church. Now, just a few words on sort of the, hunting for my water, on the institutional renewal that sort of he envisages. What concrete things can we say about institutional, structural life in the church? Where's the Pope nudging us forward? Where is he taking these steps that he knows will only bear fruit if there's interior renewal? We can't forget that. So often we get caught up because it's more interesting to talk about structural reforms. But for Pope Francis, this would be froth on nothingness. But nonetheless, there's a couple key ideas I'd like to share with you. First of all, Pope Francis is very keen, a great promoter of what he refers to as synodality. Synodality is, from its origin, means it's a way of walking together. You might be more familiar with the term collegiality, that it was first referred to the notion of bishops working together with the Pope. But it's had a broader kind of use now in Catholic circles. We'll talk about collegiality within a parish or groups. It's a secondary meaning. But the Pope doesn't talk much about collegiality. He's gone back to a more traditional term, and that is synodality. And he's very concerned and very interested in how does the church sort of move forward in listening to the voice of the Holy Spirit so that the message of Jesus Christ can really be seized and grasped and understood by people today? The term, he likes the term synodality then as a way of describing this, the living together, the working together, the deliberating together of various bodies in the church. In the last 2 years, we had an example, a concrete example of what he envisions. And that's, for example, before the extraordinary Synod on the Family in the fall of 2014, and the one last year, the Ordinary Synod on the Family in 2015, there was widespread consultation. And this time, not just with bishops who had always been invited to write their replies to papers that had been prepared, but the beginning of consultation asking for input. It was probably too short. It wouldn't have passed all the social science tests that we would like, but it was a sincere desire to have input on certain very important questions from the full people of God. Arranging this and so on, I think proved in fact to be far more difficult and complicated than was first envisioned. But the intention was the importance of people who are truly living the faith. It's very different. It's very different from just an opinion poll. And that's why it requires sifting. Some people who are living the life of grace and the Holy Spirit, who constitute the faithful, and their input was in fact sought. This is one demonstration of synodality. Another that he seems to be fostering, again, not yet fully developed, is that he seems to want to give to what we call colleges or conferences of bishops a greater role, not so much in doctrinal authority per se. The church's doctrine is universal, but how the pastoral questions are to be deliberated within a certain national or sometimes transnational space. In his Joy of the Gospel, he wrote this: "Nor do I believe that the papal magisterium, his own office, should be expected to offer a definitive or complete word on every question which affects the church and the world. It is not advisable for the Pope to take the place of local bishops in the discernment of every issue which arises in their territory. In this sense, I am conscious of the need to promote a sound decentralization. For example, a question that would be of concern to Canada, which would not be to many other nations, would be what are appropriate liturgical adaptations that could be made for First Nations or Aboriginal communities? What could be integrated? What does it mean to enculturate the gospel in those places? These are questions that have not been worked out. They're often very difficult and thorny. But the Pope certainly says, yes, these are areas in which local bishops or national could in fact propose things, obviously the same teaching, but where there would be probably some variety in the life of the universal church, because there are questions that don't concern the universal church. And so Pope Francis is fostering, I think, a vision of the church which is attuned to participation, co-responsibility, and dialogue. But the precise ways in which this is to occur are by no means clear to him or to really, I think, yet to anyone else. But the door is opening. What can we do? How do faithful people respond? A second kind of consideration is that the Pope is concerned and is showing us a new way, a way of exercising his particular ministry, which we refer to as the ministry of Peter, or the Petrine ministry. In other words, how do you pope? And Pope Francis sees his own ministry very much as being with his brother bishops. The first title he gives to himself is not Vicar of Christ or even successor of Peter. It is Bishop of Rome. Clearly, this is the title that he prefers. And he's very clear that he doesn't see other bishops as his subordinate collaborators or his mere colleagues, that he understands very clearly the Vatican Council's teaching, that there is a college of bishops, of which he is the necessary head. There can be no doubt about that. And again, he wrote a year and a half ago to the Cardinal President of the Synod of Bishops. He wrote about himself, "I too, having deeply examined the signs of the times, and with the awareness that in the exercise of my Petrine ministry, it is necessary more than ever to further revitalize the close relationship among all the pastors of the Church, I wish to value this precious heritage of the Council." Other places he speaks of the conversion of the papacy. In this, of course, he's not really radical. This was already well set out by St. John Paul II in his encyclical Udunum Sint, about the willingness to find new ways. What does it mean in the 21st century now to exercise the unique ministry that was given to Peter and that Peter must fulfill in the life of the universal church? But he also said, we have made little progress in this regard to date. We know that his sort of his preference for small cars, living in the Casa Santa Marta, his own sort of personal simplicity, he's aware those are personal attributes. They don't have in themselves structural. They have structural implications, but they're not structural changes in the papacy. He's wondering about what will it mean, and his concern for his office in the life of the worldwide church, specifically with the Orthodox. As you know, for the first time he met with the head of the Russian Orthodox Church in the waiting room in a Havana airport. Not an exalted place, but the first such meeting in centuries. The third area is, and this is one that the newspapers love, talking about the Roman Curia. That's the bureaucracy, which twice in my life I formed a part. I did it for 8 years, that surrounds the Pope and is entrusted with helping the Pope fulfill his particular mission. It's pretty clear that the Pope is suspicious of bureaucracy, of pastoral agendas, of plans. A great misgiving. He has certain misgivings, and if you read his talk in 2014 to the Roman Curia, which he talked about sort of the 10 afflictions of those in any office, could even be in a parish council, it could be in any organization to which you belong. They were fairly tough. He is even referred to the Curia at one place as the plague of the papacy. But he also knows that he does not exist without it. But he keeps repeating that the Curia is at the service of the universal church and should only intervene in matters of local churches when they are unable to resolve the difficulties themselves. That it should not be it should not be a screen between the bishops of the world or the local churches and himself. How this works out practically when you have a membership of 1.2 billion, the question of access to the Pope, he doesn't get into that, but there are questions. But he says, the Roman Curia must help both the particular churches, dioceses, and the bishops' conferences. They are instruments of help. In some cases, however, when they are not functioning well, they run the risk of becoming institutions of censorship. The Roman congregations are mediators. They are not middlemen or managers. That's one of the reasons why he is slowly, more slowly than many had thought would be possible, undertaking a gradual reform of the Roman Curia. And just a last word now to tie these together, again on how the Pope sees himself, his view of his role in the Church. He set aside, certainly, the remaining regal trappings of the papacy. He's intent on strengthening synodality. But it would be wrong to think that Pope Francis sees no specific role for his ministry among his brother bishops and among the faithful at large. Again and again, he refers to his particular mission in the Church, as he did in his visit to the United States last September, to watch over the unity of the universal Church and to encourage in charity the journey of all the particular churches, dioceses, toward ever greater knowledge, faith, and love of Jesus Christ. That's the purpose, to bring us to knowledge, faith, and love of Jesus Christ. Indeed, when he sees unity endangered, Francis does not hesitate to remind us, as he did in the closing address to the extraordinary synod on the family in 2014, that among all the bishops, and this is a really strong statement, this is what he said about himself, he is the guarantor of the obedience and the conformity of the Church to the will of God, to the gospel of Christ, and to the tradition of the Church. Nor did he hesitate to affirm that by the will of Christ he is, and he cited this, the supreme pastor and teacher of all the faithful, and that he enjoys full, immediate, and universal ordinary power over the Church. These are canonical citations that come from the First Vatican Council, not often associated with Pope Francis. And he said, my presence in the synod, when he is there, is a guarantee for all, and a guarantor for all, and a safeguard of the faith, since it unfolds the synod, his words, cum Petro et sub Petro, with Peter, with him, and under him. He likes to talk about with Peter in dealing with his brother bishops, but he is not averse to reminding bishops and the faithful that he still has the final right to decide what is and what is not of the faith. He says this is not a restriction on the freedom of the synod, but the guarantee of its unity. We will have, I think, an example of this next a week tomorrow is the publication of the apostolic exhortation on the family, the fruit of the synod. They've told us that the name is Amoris Laetitia, the joy of loving or happiness of loving, of love. That this is his word on the deliberations of the synod, in which he quite clearly sees himself as the guarantor of the orthodoxy and unity of the faith. It will be an interesting next Friday. And so, in conclusion, 50 years after the end of the Second Vatican Council, Pope Francis is pointing the church, the universal church, and the local church, our church, in the path of a profound and radical renewal, one which is, in the first place, an interior and spiritual renewal, focused on the person and having a personal relationship with Jesus Christ and the core of the gospel message, but also practical. It is, to use other terms that are tossed about, conservative and progressive. It is Franciscan and Jesuit. And even without a detailed pastoral agenda, there is no mistaking that this Holy Father has a vision for the church, and that with the patience of someone who sees God working in history, that he is moving us towards it with patience and with clear-sighted determination. Thank you very much. Read in the questions.
Thank you very much, Your Grace. As I'm going to just recap with you some of our housekeeping rules for questions, we do have microphones on both sides of the room. So if you have questions and you want to ask them, if you don't mind queuing up on both sides, that would be great. A quick recap of the basic rules that we have for questions. I go through this all the time, sometimes in some futility, but nonetheless, it's worth going through. I'll acknowledge questions on both sides. Please use the microphone. Please be concise and try to have a question. I know sometimes we want to make a statement. The statement or the soliloquy needs to be followed up by something concrete that the Archbishop can respond to. That would be very helpful. And so we will start on this side, please. Thank you.
When I received this revelation of resurrection, this is very powerful. And that is after September 11, the Lord is for me, 20% only raised from the dead. But now, 3/4 of the globe, because I spread this to more than 200 countries, to all leaders. So 1/4 more that we need to come together, all denominations. They don't need to change their religion, but be united in one faith. So when we all do this, we are not only resurrected, delivered, healed, but peace this year, 2016. So only 3. Number 1 is when we have.
Do you have what's the question, so I can grab a question? I haven't.
So question first.
A question.
You got to ask me a question.
Also, okay. So that is, I have no question, but only reflection of what you said.
Okay, thank you very much.
So, can I continue? Okay.
Thanks. Thank you very much.
My question is what I guess philosophers would call a thought experiment, Your Grace, so I would appreciate a fulsome answer to my question, if it's possible. Suppose the Pope, current Pope Francis, died tomorrow, and another Pope who was more conservative. Let's call Francis. All right. Let's say in the popular parlance of what people would consider to be conservative, as opposed to what a theologian might call conservative and liberal. If you try to get gist of what I'm saying, and the next Pope came in and he reversed very quickly everything that Francis was trying to do now. Where would Catholics stand in a church like that?
Right. I don't know, the things that maybe Francis, I'm not sure exactly what you're referring to. I mean, if he decided to go back and live in the apostolic palace, or was perhaps not as energetic in his perhaps his outreach to the poor. But if you look at Francis in terms of his doctrinal, what is at the core of the teaching, that no pope is going to reverse that. There'll be changes of style as Francis has changed styles and so on, and emphases. But I don't believe that. I'm convinced, in fact, that there would never be a reversal of anything substantive. As yet, in Francis's teaching, he has never invoked the fullness of his teaching authority. Everything that he says is backed up pretty much by somebody else and by what we've believed. So I don't have that fear. There certainly could be a change in style, just as Francis overturned some of the style of living the way of doing things. A new pope might decide that he needs a Mercedes instead of a Fiat. Very well, and I think, but we've had changes. You know, there have always been great. John the 23rd was a big change from Pius the 12th. Then there was the somewhat more austere Paul the 6th, a pope, a sunny pope for 33 days. There's variation in popes as there is in bishops and in pastors, as in families and as in any organization. But discontinuity at any substantive level, I'm convinced that the guidance of the Spirit of the Church would not lead us in that direction.
Thank you.
This is from one of our viewers who's watching online, Glenn Hickey, and he's the director of the Office of Religious Education in the Diocese of Victoria. He says, St. Augustine said, God who created you without you will not justify you without you. In other words, we need to cooperate with God's grace. We have a part to play. At what point is there a danger of emphasizing God's mercy too much, leading us to presumption, a lack of responsibility, and a sense of cheap grace? How can we learn to fully trust in God's constant love and yet not take it for granted?
That's a terrific question. In some ways, it answers itself. That it is mistaken to think that mercy is cheap grace, that mercy is God's constant invitation and offer to us. But it's an offer that is not forced upon us, that demands, because we are free human beings, that we accept that grace, which implies a conversion to the love of God. Sometimes mercy, I think, is presented popularly as, well, it doesn't matter what you do, I'll forgive you anyways. I think when we're talking about divine mercy, it's more complex, and it's offered to us, but it demands something of us. It's a love offered, but it must be a love returned. But that does point to a really serious question, because we do know that we must cooperate, that we must respond to the graces that are offered to us. Otherwise, we're mere automatons. It would be the negation of our ability to love freely. But it is I think there's a popular misunderstanding often that mercy is just forget about it. I love you, so it doesn't matter. That's not mercy in the way in which I think Pope Francis and the Church's tradition sees mercy.
Thank you, Sam.
Thanks, Christy.
I wondered if you might have a few comments with respect to the relationship between Pope Francis and Pope Emeritus Benedict XVI. I think one of the sometimes forgotten things is obviously that perhaps the most radical in terms of historical moves was Benedict stepping down that enabled Francis to assume his role today. So I wonder if you might have some words of wisdom to us with respect to their relationship, and not just their theological relationship, but maybe even their personal relationship.
Thanks very much, Sam. There are some very tender images of Pope Benedict and Pope Francis. I find it hard to call him Pope Emeritus. It's a strange term. First of all, Pope Francis is enormously indebted theologically, and even in his homilies, to Pope Benedict. I've had the opportunity to read a lot of Pope Benedict and Pope Francis, and you can see that he takes the sort of the theological meat of Pope Benedict and gives it a wonderfully sort of popular, very more understandable sort of dress. They're about their real personal relationship, I don't know. That there are wonderful pictures of him, that Pope Benedict is received frequently, it seems, by Pope Francis. They say that Pope Francis talks with them often. You know, the verification of that, I don't know. But they are men of different temperaments, but also of enormous kind of continuity. There's a great picture of them at Castel Gandolfo when Pope Francis went out to see him, and they're both sort of on a prie-dieu in the chapel. It's something I never thought that I'd see sort of two popes together, or, you know, one retired pope or emeritus pope and a living pope. And the resignation of Benedict was one of the most radical acts of the papacy in the last 100 years, in fact. Something that no one, talk about a God of surprises, no one had anticipated, and was in fact, quite surprisingly, and perhaps even more remarkably, a secret that was kept, that was not leaked. Probably one of the few things in history that hasn't been leaked.
Please.
Yeah. Good evening. It was really interesting to listen to you, and I wanted to ask you what the Pope and maybe the Church think, because we always see the poor, or the Church talks about the poor. And you said that we're beneficiary because we see in them the suffering of Christ, but on the other hand, well, that implies like there is, you know, poverty is only mainly. My question is it only a product of greed by the rest of society, or could it be also like the prodigal son, that they get close to, they close the doors to God, maybe because they weren't taught to open their doors to God. But so I think the Church has to treat this subject more completely, and I don't see the Pope, or maybe you can explain us this, because if you don't show the whole picture completely, it seems like the poor are like only victims, and they don't have much to do on their own.
Yeah, okay. I don't think that the Pope sees the poor as only victims. He often certainly speaks of inequality and injustice, but he endows them with a real dignity of personhood, and indeed insists that we learn from them. The term poor, of course, does not mean destitute. That's not what pobre or povero means. It means simple. It means without reliance upon great wealth, the kind of wealth that we have. And I think that there are multiple meanings. I mean, it's a polyvalent word. There is real poverty, and the Pope often is talking about real poverty, and he does that frequently. And he, in Evangelii Gaudium, he put forward his sort of views about why this happened, or his kind of taking down on the trickle-down effect and so on. But he also talks about, and he has talked about, the poor. He talks about intellectual poverty. He talks about spiritual poverty, that poverty has many different layers, but he doesn't, I think he's also afraid that in the Western world, we go very quickly to those poverties and forget about the poverty which is, can easily be undignified because of its lack of basic human, the basic human necessities.
Please.
Good evening, Your Grace. You spoke about the Pope seeing his role as really the safeguard or watching over the unity of the Universal Church. So I'm just wondering what we, as mostly lay Catholics in the room, can do to be more united to the Pope.
Well, I think the problem is not that being united to the Pope. I think it's more being united to one another. That there is, in in the world at large, and this is probably written even in larger characters now, if you watch CNN as I do, because I lived in the States for a number of years, the desire of people to be in opposition to one another, and to be always divided, that everything is winners and losers. This can also infect organizations. It can infect schools. It can infect parishes, where the humility or the ability to listen is compromised. That it's, I'm right at all costs. There's something in the water that we're drinking that seems to propel us to running always to our own small group, and not even just being content with that, having to oppose others, having to put down all of these things that eat away at unity of purpose and are so destructive. One of the things the Pope talks about an awful lot is gossip. Most popes haven't really talked about gossip. It would seem almost too small a thing to talk about. But he speaks about it frequently, and what it means to be tearing down others, how these are the small ways in which unity becomes fractured. It's easy to say I'm obedient to the Pope because he's very far away and all of this, but the real measure of unity is family unity, parish unity, work unity, all of these things. And there is something, I'm afraid, in our culture, at least I see, that seems to prefer disharmony to harmony. That we like to be in opposition. This seems to be a way of somehow asserting our true individualism or our creativity or our who-ness. And it's extraordinarily destructive of I think, of the fibers that undergird both civil and ecclesial life. Sorry. No, don't.
Thank you, Your Grace. Please join me in thanking His Grace for a fantastic presentation. One of the things I failed to mention in my introduction of him was that he's also the Chancellor of St. Mark's College. So we're just so grateful to have him here. He's sort of like my boss, I guess, in that sense. So it's a little remiss of me not to acknowledge that.
Laura's making another claim.
Yes, I know. I've got many bosses in this room right now, actually, as I look around, so I've got to be careful. I'd like to also acknowledge the time and assistance of different organizations and individuals that have made this evening possible. The Newman Association and the Newman Club, who have both assisted us this evening with regard to our mail-out and promotions and setup. I'd also like to thank key individuals at the colleges, including Florence Alechan, our Director of Development, Teresa Domingo, and Christina Dumont for all their work in getting this evening set up. I ask you now to take a moment, if you've not done so, to fill out the card at your seat so that we can continue to keep you informed on public lectures in the future. And I'd remind you again, in order to defray the costs of these public lectures, if you would consider making a donation with one of our student or staff representatives on the way out, we'd appreciate it. Please mark your calendars for our next public lecture, which will be on April 27th, 2016. You got a brief sense of maybe who that person will be in one of our questions. When St. Mark's pastoral philosopher in residence, Dr. Sam Rocha, will speak on God, art, and the way of beauty. So I'd ask you to please pick up a flyer for that on your way out. Finally, I would invite you to please join us at Plato's Cave for a wine and cheese reception after leaving the building. Thank you so much.